What if tomorrow remembers what you forgot? Reflections of Mosy Kan. There is a question that most people never think to ask. Not because it is too difficult, not because the answer is hidden, but because the question itself requires a particular kind of stillness, the kinds that most of us avoid. The question is this: what if the things you have forgotten are not finished with you? Not in the way of haunting, not in the way of trauma lingering at the surface, but in a quite a more fundamental sense. What if forgetting something and being free of it are not the same thing? What if you can lose a memory completely, let it sink beneath years of newer experience, newer faces, newer worries, and still carry its weight without ever knowing you are carrying it? We tend to think of memory as a record, the official account of what happened, and we tend to think that when the record is gone, the event is gone with it. But that is not how consequences work. A stone dropped into still water creates rings. The stone sinks, eventually it disappears from view, but the rings continue outward, but long after the stone is no longer visible. And this, in its simplest form, is what we are going to explore today. Not memory, consequence. And the strange, unsettling possibility that tomorrow, not as a date, not as a destination, but as a perspective, a position from which everything prior becomes visible, that tomorrow may already contain the shape of everything you have forgotten. The forgotten things. Let us begin with something that actually happens. A child is told at a young age that they are not particularly clever, perhaps by a parent, perhaps by a teacher, perhaps in a tone so casual that no one in the room noticed it was a wound. Years pass. The child becomes an adult. The specific moment, the exact words, the room, the weather outside, the expression on the face, all of it fades. And the adult, if asked, might say with genuine sincerity, "I don't remember anything like that happening." And they may be entirely correct, but here's the strange part. That same adult, when presented with an opportunity that requires confidence, feels something they cannot name, a hesitation without origin, a doubt that seems larger than the situation warrants. They search for its source. They find nothing. They conclude, perhaps, that this is simply who they are, cautious, measured, not someone who reaches too far. And they may spend decades living inside the self-concept built from something they no longer remember. This is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It is the evidence that the architecture of a life can be built on foundations that have become invisible. Now, consider the opposite. A person early in life is trusted with something small, a task, a responsibility. Someone looks at them and says, without ceremony, "I know you can handle this." They handle it. Nothing extraordinary happens. The moment passes, the memory fades. But something else was installed, a sense, not quite conscious, that difficulty is manageable, that the space between what they know how to do and what is being asked of them is a space that they can cross. Decades later, this person is described by others as resilient, as someone who does not seem rattled by uncertainty. Ask them where that came from. They will not know. They may attribute it to personality, to temperament, to something they were simply born with. And perhaps they are partially right. But somewhere earlier forgotten moment did something to them, and tomorrow carried it forward. The illusion of forgetting. The human mind is often described as a kind of storage system. We speak of memories as things we access, we all lose, the way a library might lose a book. But this metaphor is misleading. A library that loses a book simply has one fewer book. The absence is total and clean. The mind is not like that. When the memory fades, what actually disappears is our conscious access to the event, the story, the imagery, the narrative sequence. What does not necessarily disappear is the imprint the event made on our patterns of response. This distinction matters enormously. Think of it this way. A river over time carves a path through stone. If you removed every photograph of that river, every map, every record, every satellite image, the path it carved would still be there. The landscape would still bear the shape of water that had long since moved on. Forgetting is in many ways like removing the photographs. The record disappears. The carving remains. What we call personality, the particular way a person responds to criticism, to intimacy, to failure, to sudden opportunity, is not simply something they were born with, fully formed. It is a landscape shaped by a river that we can no longer see. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with. Imagine two people identical in every measurable way at birth. Same genetics, same apparent capacity, same basic temperament. Place them in subtly different environments for the first decade of life. Not dramatically different, not obviously abusive or obviously nurturing. Just slightly different in the kind of feedback they receive, the kind of risk they are implicitly encouraged to take, the kind of love they receive as its consistency, its conditions. Now let a further 2 or 3 decades pass. By middle age, these two people may be almost unrecognizable as having started from the same place. Not because of what they remember from those early years, most of it will be gone, but because of what those years installed. The forgotten experiences did not disappear. They became the operating assumptions of two different lives. Tomorrow as a perspective. This is a point where we need to think about tomorrow differently. We typically treat tomorrow as a location, a point on a timeline, somewhere we have not yet arrived. But consider for a moment treating tomorrow not as a place but as a perspective, a vantage point from which the full shape of today becomes visible, from where you stand right now. You can see today with all its texture and uncertainty. You can feel the weight of present decisions. You are inside the experience. But tomorrow, by definition, stands just outside it. And from that position, the consequences of today begin to clarify in ways that cannot be seen from within. Tomorrow is where causes become visible as causes. Tomorrow is where the pattern of hundreds forgotten decisions finally resolves into a recognizable shape, a direction, a character, an outcome. This is why tomorrow often feels like a revelation. Not because the future contains information the present does not, but because tomorrow is the perspective from which the logic of everything that came before finally becomes legible. And if this is true, if tomorrow is a perspective more than a destination, then it carries something remarkable. It carries memory that you do not. Not the personal narrative kind of memory, not photographs and stories, but the structural kind, the kind built into outcomes, into relationships, into the arc of a life. Tomorrow remembers through what exists, through what was built or broken, or avoided or chosen. The future does not store the past, it is made of it. The invisible weight. This brings us to something that most people have experienced, without having a framework to explain it. The sense of being burdened by something you cannot identify, not grief, not anxiety in any clinical sense, something more diffuse, a kind of gravitational pull, in a direction you did not consciously choose. A person finds themselves year after year drawn to relationships with a particular quality, perhaps a familiar emotional distance, perhaps a recurring dynamic they recognized in retrospect but could not predict in the moment. They try to understand it, they examine their conscious preferences, they look at what they believe they want, but the pattern persists independent of what they believe. And this gap between what a person consciously wants and what their behavior actually pursues is often the gap between the remembered self and the shaped self. The remembered self is who we think we are. The reshaped self is who we actually are. The result of every experience that ever left a mark, including the ones that left no memory. Consider fear. Most people, if they feel fear in a situation, assume there is something in the current situation that warrants it. They look for the treat in front of them. And sometimes they find it, but sometimes they do not. The situation is objectively manageable. The fear is disproportionate. And no matter how many times this is demonstrated, the fear does not fully respond to the evidence. This is not irrationality in a simple sense. It is operation of a lesson that was learned so early, so intensely, that it was written into the person's nervous system. Because it could be examined by thought, the memory of what thoughts the lesson may be gone. But the lesson itself remains, active, responsive, quietly shaping every encounter with anything that faintly resembles what first created it. Tomorrow inherited that lesson. Tomorrow has been operating according to it, and the person carrying it may not know it exists. What is still following you? At this point, the question begins to form, and it is not a comfortable one. How much of your life right now, today, is being directed by things you no longer remember? Not the decisions you think about, not the preferences you have examined and chosen, but the underlying architecture. The reasons you trust certain people quickly and others never. The reasons certain kinds of criticism feels unbearable, while other kinds slide past without leaving a mark. The reasons certain opportunities feel exciting, while others, objectively similar, feel somehow dangerous. These are not random. They have a history. And the question is not whether that history exists. It does for everyone. But whether it is serving the person you are now, or whether it is serving a version of you that no longer exists anywhere except in its consequences. This is the particular strangeness of the forgotten past. We tend to do the work of self-examination through memory. We revisit experiences. We reinterpret old events. We try to understand why we are the way we are by looking at what we can still see. But what about everything that cannot be seen? What about the experiences that faded before we had the language to examine them? The early years whose details are now inaccessible. The small, repeated moments that cumulatively shaped something but left no single memorable event behind. These are not recoverable through memory. They can only be inferred, works backward from the consequences they created, approached not through recall, but through honest attention to pattern, to what keeps happening, to what keeps feeling true even when evidence contradicts it, to what keeps being chosen unconsciously again and again. And perhaps this is one of the things that makes self-knowledge generally difficult. Not remembered experiences, not at least are visible enough to examine, but the forgotten ones, the ones that left no story, only a shape. Now, perhaps this is the moment. Not the moment when you agree with me, not the moment when you understand every word, but the moment when something begins to open, because these reflections were never meant to give you answers. They were meant to leave a question behind. And maybe one day, long after this voice has fallen silent, you will encounter a moment in your life that suddenly gives these words a different meaning. A moment when you realize that the message was never inside the reading. The message was inside you, waiting for the right moment to be understood. If there is a purpose to these reflections, it is not that you understand them today. It is not that one day, perhaps unexpectedly, life itself will continue the conversation. And when that moment arrives, you may discover that these readings were never trying to teach you something. They were trying to prepare you to recognize something that was always there, waiting to be seen. If there is a purpose to these reflections, it is not that you understand them today. It is that one day, perhaps unexpectedly, life itself will continue the conversation. And when that moment arrives, you may discover that these readings were never trying to teach you something. They were trying to prepare you to recognize something, something that was always there, waiting to be seen.